Shalom, dear friends. How are you? This is Yehuda Glick from Shalom Jerusalem Foundation. And today, it's the 20th of the Hebrew calendar Iyar, but it's the 14th of May. 14th of May is a very special date in the history of the State of Israel. And more on, it's a very special date in the relationship between the United States of America and the history of Israel. And I want to take you back to 1948. 1948, or actually in 1917, as you all know, the Balfour Declaration. The British have decided to recognize the right of the Jewish people to receive a national home state. This was later in 1920 in San Remo Conference, recognized worldwide, officially, that the Jewish people have a right to a home state in the area of Palestine. But meanwhile, until the Israelis, the Jewish people are ready to get their state, the land will be run by the British mandate. And the British, shalom to Zarda, shalom, how are you? And the British were supposed to run the area of the Palestinian area and have it in their mandate until the Jews were ready to establish a state. In 1947, 29th of November, in 1947, 29th of November, the United Nations votes for the partition agreement. The partition means that the area of Palestine will be divided to two states, a Jewish one and an Arab one. The Arabs turn down and begin fighting with the state of Israel. But on the 14th of May, 1948, the British decide that they're fed up with waiting and they're moving out. The United States, and actually the British, thought that what should be happen now is there should be only an Arab state. But they moved out. And the State Department of the United States, partially because of its obligatory and international remit and its wide strategic concerns, was unflinchingly opposed to Zionism. And they came out and they specifically said that they're against, and they explained it for several reasons. I'll read from what Philip Baram writes in his the volume, The Department of State in the Middle East. In the duel between the State Department and the American Zionists, the latter were increasingly the losers from the mid-20s. And despite pro-Zionist endorsements and testimonials to the contrary of the congressional and state legislative levels. Despite seasonal White House proclamations, Zionism was largely dismissed as a chronic nuisance. The department considered that in its various policy positioning, there was no reason to fear alienating pro-Zionist feelings. By the way, even amongst the American Jews, there was a lot of anti-Zionism. Anyway, Truman, by the way, President Truman, who was at the time the President of the United States, but he was only appointed, he wasn't elected. He was appointed because 3 years earlier, President Roosevelt suddenly passed away. At the age of 63, he suddenly passed away, and President Truman became president. President Roosevelt you can't say he was very friendly to the Jewish people. Sometimes he was willing to hear and to listen, but he was really not going to go out of his way to support the state of Israel. What was Truman going to do? And the world was going to wait to see what was Truman going to do. What was Truman? Shalom, Beverly from Texas. The world was waiting to see what will President Truman do. And as I said, the Department of State specialists on the Near East, without exception, were unfriendly to the idea of a Jewish state. Their thinking went along this line. Great Britain has maintained her position in the area by cultivating the Arabs. Now that she seems no longer able to hold the position, the United States should take over, and it must be done exactly the same formula. If the Arabs are antagonized, they'll go over to the Soviet camp. Truman's most prestigious appointee, George Marshall, with the one that Truman called the Secretary of State, George Marshall. Truman once said about him, he's the great one of the age. And he himself was also solidly opposed to the Zionism write-up. And beyond the country's recognition of Israel, he was totally against it. Though he recognized there were some humanitarian aspects, Marshall did not share any of the sentimental affinity for Zionism. He said the Palestinian issue ultimately boiled down. And he said the United States must choose, listen carefully, what was best for the United States. This is what George Marshall said. And actually the entire Department of State supported this. As I said before, Reform Jews, the dominant body in the country since the late 19th century, broadly were also their early leaders were liberal intellectuals, and they were also, the Reform Judaism was not only a religion for the liberated mind, but it was now forever anti-nationalist. To those of us who are Jews in religion and Americans in nationality, political Zionism was an anathema. The modern Jew detached from ancient rituals in the synagogue. That's what the Reform Jews leaders spoke about. In the Congress, the Zionists received the most consistent support. But even here, there was not much chance. And here, as for President Truman, as for the presidency, he was a little concerned because President Roosevelt usually represented himself saying as if it was a great Democratic Party concerns, and how Harry Truman and George Marshall, however, did reflect broader national perspectives, but Truman, a former soldier serving abroad in both world wars and a Secretary of State, his appointee Marshall, reflecting his own international perspective and those of the department, was clear-minded hostility towards Zionism. So what happens now? President Truman invites them all to the Oval Office, and he wants to hear what their opinion is, and he hears a total against the state of Israel from the Department of State. But then Truman's religious, biblical soul wakes up. And 11 minutes after the state of Israel is announced, President Truman decides to recognize the state of Israel. April 14th, 1948, 11 minutes after the state of Israel is announced. That's the first May 14th. The next May 14th, 2018, 70 years after the establishment of the state of Israel. 70 years after the establishment of the state of Israel, President Donald Trump decides that he wants to recognize Jerusalem, as was actually decided in the Congress in 1995. But again and again it was waived. And guys, you have to hear what the European world is calling up President Trump. European foreign ministries slammed the U.S. decision to move its embassy to Jerusalem, saying that it violates international law, it's unwise, and it will exacerbate tensions. Turkey's foreign ministry says the action is null and void and illegitimate. The Secretary of State, the Foreign Minister of Turkey, comes out with an announcement. We strongly condemn the decision of violating international law and all relevant UN resolutions. We reiterate that this action is legally null and void. We emphasize that such a step which disregards the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people will not serve peace and stability in the region. The French foreign minister comes out again also, and he attacks the Israeli action, the American action, and he says, don't do it. The Irish foreign minister said the move is inflaming a very tense situation. The Dutch foreign minister, Stef Blok, says, we don't consider it to be a wise decision to move the embassy. Actually, the entire European Union wanted to come out condemning it, but the Czech Republic, the Hungarians, and the Romanians blocked the 28-nation European Union. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1948, the Americans were warned by the Department of State not to recognize Israel. President Truman recognized Israel because of his biblical connections. In 2018, President Trump was pressured from all over the world not to recognize Israel and not to recognize Jerusalem and not to move the embassy to Jerusalem. But he was awoken by his Bible-believing friends telling him this is what's right to be done. And President Trump announces that he is doing what is right to be done. Shalom from Belarus. Shalom. Shalom to all our friends from all over the world that are watching us. So President Trump was warned not to do it. President Truman was warned not to do it. President Truman was a president who was not even elected. Quite obvious that if President Roosevelt would have been in office, he would not recognize Israel. It's quite obvious that if President Trump, who also nobody thought he had a chance to be elected, would not have been elected, President or so-called President Hillary Clinton would not recognize Jerusalem as the capital. And why am I telling you all this? I'll tell you why. Today again, May 14th, 2020, in Israel tonight, we will be inaugurating a new government. And there was a little bit of an issue. It will be accepting President Trump's deal of the century. Yes, that's what it said. And the first step in July will be recognizing Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. And you know what we hear from the European Union? You know what we hear from the Palestinians? It's illegal. It's against international law. You're going to inflame the stability of the region. But once again, we understand that the return of the people of Israel back to Israel is a godly event. It's a biblical event. And therefore, it's a biblical event. And just like, in spite of all the warnings, that who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East if Truman recognizes Israel? Who knows what's going to happen in the Middle East if President Trump moves the embassy to Jerusalem? Once again, all our friends from all around the world are warning us. Who knows what's going to happen if we recognize Israeli sovereignty, Israeli law over the settlements in Judea and Samaria? But we have to be determined. We have to be committed. We have to be devoted, because Jerusalem is the foundation of our faith. The Bible is the foundation of our faith. God's covenant with the people of Israel is the foundation of our state. And once again tonight, on May 14th, when the new Israeli government will be sworn in, it will be determined not to allow all of those so-called friends who are warning us, who knows what's going to happen. What should guide us is what's right. And what should guide us is the Word of God. And what should guide us is the right Of course, Israel is a democratic state. We will give all of our civilians full human rights. But what's important is to do what is right. And what is right today, anybody with his eyes open understands that establishing a Palestinian state over all of Judea and Samaria will endanger the state of Israel. It's suicide. And what's right to do now is to continue the Zionist process and to establish a Jewish state all over Israel, including the biblical land of Judea and Samaria. We're not going to call it West Bank. We're not going to call it Palestine. We're not going to be afraid of all the threats, whether for the Palestinian threats or the threats coming from anybody else. Or as somebody says here right now, as the mountains are round about Jerusalem, so the Lord is round about the people from henceforth, even forever. Psalm 125, which we studied this week, exactly the same thing. God is surrounding his nation. God is surrounding his people. And God is here. We're not going to do things that are going to endanger ourselves, but we're going to do what's right. And what's right today is to establish the Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria. So tonight, I want to send blessings to the new Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Netanyahu, who politically understood the importance of uniting with his component, with his political with Benny Gantz, who represents the left part of the side of the Israeli political arena. And together they're establishing a strong unity government. And I hope they will be establishing, as I said, Israeli sovereignty over Judea and Samaria, and the world will eventually recognize it. And congratulations, Israel. Be blessed. Thank you so much, Marcus Bender from Germany. And blessings to all our friends all over the world. Continue visiting Shalom Jerusalem Foundation YouTube channel, Shalom Jerusalem Foundation Facebook page, and continue joining the movement of the Shalom Jerusalem Foundation. Blessings from Jerusalem. We love you all, and shalom from Jerusalem.